14 October 1943. 10:32 in the morning. 25,000 feet above Nazi Germany. A formation of American bombers cuts through the thin air, their engines droning in a steady mechanical chorus. Sunlight flashes off bare aluminum skins, momentarily beautiful, momentarily calm, as if nothing in this sky wants to kill them. But beneath one of those aircraft, hanging alone against the clouds, a metal sphere slowly rotates. Inside it, a young man curls his body inward, knees drawn tight to his chest, boots pressed against steel-gloved hands wrapped around twin machine guns. There is no room to stand, no room to turn, no room for fear to go anywhere except deeper. This position has a name. They call it Suicide Charley. The B-17 flying fortress was never meant to look fragile. From a distance, it appears invincible, thick wings, multiple engines, bristling gun positions covering every approach. American doctrine promised that tight formations of these bombers could fight their way through any enemy airspace in daylight. For a time, that promise seemed true. Then German fighter pilots discovered the underside. From below, the bomber appeared vulnerable. Its guns could not depress far enough. Its belly looked unguarded. Luftwaffe pilots dived upward, firing directly into engines, fuel tanks, and crew compartments. Bombers began to fall not one by one, but in flames, entire formations unraveling in midair. The answer came not from a new aircraft, but from a single man placed where no one wanted to go. The ball turret. A steel globe mounted beneath the fuselage, suspended over open sky, rotating freely in all directions. Two 50 caliber machine guns protruded from its sides, pointing downward, directly into the path of attacking fighters. To operate it, the gunner had to climb into the turret after takeoff, folding himself into a space barely large enough for a human body. Once sealed inside, he was alone, cut off from the rest of the crew by metal, noise, and altitude. There was no parachute inside the turret. If the aircraft was hit, if the turret jammed, if the landing gear failed, escape was a question mark, not a promise. Everyone knew it. And yet, someone always climbed in. Most of them were teenagers. Boys who had never been farther from home than the next town over, now floating miles above enemy territory, watching the earth drift slowly beneath their boots. They learned quickly that the sky was not empty. It was crowded with danger, flak bursting like black flowers, tracer rounds stitching the air, fighters climbing toward them with guns already firing. From inside the sphere, the world never stopped moving. Sky became ground, ground became sky. The bomber banked, shuddered, and shook under the force of explosions. Every vibration traveled directly into the gunner's spine. The first time enemy fighters appeared below, some gunners froze. The second time, they didn't. The machine guns roared, filling the turret with smoke and heat. Tracer rounds reached out in bright red arcs, climbing toward aircraft that moments earlier had believed themselves untouchable. Some never pulled away. Wings tore free, engines burst into flame. Fighters vanished beneath the bomber, leaving only smoke and falling debris. The dead zone was no longer dead. But the cost was relentless. German flak gunners aimed low where the turret hung exposed. A single fragment could tear through the thin armor, rupture hydraulics, or shatter glass. When the turret lost power, it could freeze in place, often pointing straight down. A bomber could not land like that. Crews practiced emergency procedures, cranking the turret up by hand, shouting instructions through intercoms that sometimes went silent at the worst possible moment. Seconds mattered, strength mattered, luck mattered most of all. Some bombers landed safely. Some didn't. Inside the turret, the cold was constant. At altitude, temperatures plunged far below zero. Frost formed on the inside of the glass. Fingers stiffened. Oxygen masks iced over. Gunners fought numbness as much as enemy aircraft, knowing that if they lost feeling in their hands, they lost the guns, and if they lost the guns, the bomber was already dead. Mission after mission, they watched the sky fill with fire. They saw friendly aircraft disintegrate without warning. They watched parachutes bloom and sometimes fail too. They learned to keep firing while pieces of other planes struck their turret, hammering the metal like hail. There was no glory in it, only survival. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe had changed its tactics again. Attacks from below became rare. German pilots feared the rotating sphere beneath the bomber more than any other gun position. The presence of a single man, curled into steel, had reshaped the air war over Europe. But reshaping the war did not make the job any safer. For every mission completed, another waited, another climb, another descent into the sphere, another moment when the hatch closed and the world shrank to glass, guns, and open sky. The nickname endured because it felt honest. Suicide Charley was not a legend created after the war. It was a truth spoken quietly during it, by men who knew that courage did not always look like charging forward. Sometimes it looked like climbing down. No one asked for the ball turret. It was assigned quietly, often at the end of training when the lists were read and names were matched to positions. Pilots nodded, navigators adjusted their maps, waist gunners checked their belts. And one man learned that his war would be fought upside down. Training films spoke calmly about procedures. They explained how to rotate the turret, how to lead a target, how to clear jams. They never mentioned the feeling of the hatch locking shut above your head, or the sound it made when it sealed, a final hollow clang that echoed inside the sphere. On the first mission, most gunners stopped breathing for a moment after the door closed. Then the bomber crossed the enemy coast. Flak rose to meet it almost immediately. Black bursts punched holes in the sky, rocking the aircraft with concussive force. The turret swung violently as the pilot maneuvered. The gunner's body pressed hard against restraints designed more for function than comfort. Below, the ground was impossibly far away. Rivers curled like threads. Roads looked like scratches in the earth. Somewhere down there were people who would never know the gunner's name. The intercom crackled, voices rose and fell, warnings came fast. Fighters, 6 o'clock low. This was the ball turret gunner's moment. He rotated the sphere downward, searching the sky beneath the bomber. The glass distorted distance, warping shapes at the edges. It took time to learn how to see through it properly, how to trust instinct more than sight. The first fighter appeared suddenly, climbing hard, its nose flashing with muzzle fire. The gunner squeezed the triggers. The recoil slammed through the turret, vibrating his entire body. Tracers streaked upward, climbing faster than thought. The fighter broke away at the last second, missing the bomber by yards. The gunner kept firing until the guns clicked empty. That night he did not sleep. After that, it became routine. Mission followed mission, each one erasing a little more of what life had been before. Crews learned to read each other without speaking. A glance, a nod, a cigarette offered without a word. The ball turret gunner always climbed out last. Sometimes his legs shook so badly he had to be helped back inside the fuselage. Sometimes he laughed too loudly. Sometimes he said nothing at all. As the war intensified, German pilots grew more aggressive. Some attacked head-on from below, firing until the last second. Others rolled inverted and fired upward, trying to stay outside the turret's arc. The ball turret responded the only way it could, by turning, tracking, and firing. When it worked, the results were immediate and final. Fighters vanished in flashes of flame. Pieces of aluminum struck the turret with enough force to dent the armor. Oil smeared the glass, turning the world dark and red until the gunner wiped it away with a gloved hand. When it didn't work, the bomber paid the price. Engines caught fire, control cables snapped, entire sections of aircraft tore loose under the strain. Sometimes the order to bail out came too late. From the turret, the gunner watched men leap into the void, their parachutes blooming into fragile white flowers against the smoke. He could not follow them. If the bomber was doomed, his fate depended on whether the turret would move. Hydraulic failures became every gunner's nightmare. The controls would go slack, the rotation would slow then stop. The turret would freeze, angled toward the earth, the guns pointing uselessly into space. Above him, the crew shouted instructions. Hands cranked emergency mechanisms. Sweat froze on faces as altitude and time ran out. Sometimes the turret came up just in time. Sometimes it didn't. Those stories traveled faster than official reports. Crews whispered about landings gone wrong, about what happened when steel met concrete at full speed. No one confirmed them. No one needed to. The cold made everything worse. At altitude, frost crept along the glass until the world looked like it was being viewed through ice. Oxygen flowed thin and dry. Fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again. Some gunners lost circulation permanently. They climbed back in any way. Letters home avoided details. They spoke of clouds, of travel, of doing their part. Parents read them at kitchen tables, unaware that their sons spent hours curled into metal spheres, staring straight down at the possibility of death. By late 1943, the ball turret had earned its reputation. German pilots respected it. American crews depended on it. But respect did not make it safe. Every mission was still a gamble. Every descent into the turret was still a choice. And every time the hatch closed, Suicide Charley claimed another soul, whether the bomber came home or not. The war in the air did not pause for reflection. The next target was already ahead. And beneath the bomber, the turret began to turn once more. There were moments when the war seemed to slow. Not because the danger lessened, but because the mind learned how to survive it. Ball turret gunners began to recognize patterns in the chaos. The way flak crept upward before bursting, the slight hesitation in a fighter's climb before it committed to an attack, the sound of a damaged engine compared to a healthy one. These were lessons learned without classrooms, without manuals, learned through repetition and fear. Some gunners developed rituals, tapping the glass before entering, touching the guns in a certain order, counting breaths as the hatch closed, small habits that created the illusion of control in a place where control was mostly an illusion. The Luftwaffe did not stop adapting. German pilots began firing from longer distances, hopping to disable the turret before closing in. Others attacked simultaneously, one drawing the gunner's attention while another climbed unseen. A few rolled inverted beneath the bomber, firing upward through the blind angles that remained. Every successful tactic lasted only until the gunners adjusted. Every adjustment cost lives. Inside the turret, the air smelled permanently of oil and cordite. Spent casings rattled around the gunners' boots until they were ejected through chutes beneath the sphere. The vibration never stopped. Even when no one was firing, the engines above hummed through the metal like a living thing. Fatigue became constant. Missions lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. The gunner remained curled the entire time, muscles cramped, blood pooled in legs, pain turned dull, then sharp, then distant. Coming out of the turret, after a long mission, felt like being reborn painfully. Some men collapsed the moment they stood, others blacked out. Medics learned to recognize the signs and caught them before they fell. Commanders noticed the strain but had no alternative. The bomber still needed protection from below. Stories began circulating of gunners who endured the impossible. One survived after his turret was hit repeatedly. The glass shattered, wind screaming through the opening as he kept firing until the fighters broke away. Another lost oxygen at altitude, blacked out, and woke moments later when the bomber descended, hands still locked on the triggers by muscle memory alone. Some returned with frostbite so severe their fingers turned black, they were grounded temporarily. They begged to fly again. The worst moments came when the bomber was hit badly enough that everyone knew it might not return. From the turret, the gunner could see the damage before anyone else. Flames licking along the wing roots, fuel streaming into the slipstream, pieces of aircraft breaking away and vanishing behind. The order to bail out echoed through the intercom. The gunner looked up. If the turret moved, he climbed out. If it didn't, there was nothing to do but wait. In those seconds, time stretched impossibly long. Some men prayed. Some cursed. Some simply stared down at the earth rushing closer, understanding that they were about to become part of it. There were miracles. Bombers limped home on 2 engines, sometimes 1. Crews landed with brakes gone, flaps torn away, fuselages riddled with holes. The ball turret retracted at the last moment, scraping the runway as the aircraft bounced to a stop. Those gunners lived. Others did not. Losses were recorded in clean, typed reports: aircraft number, crew count, status, missing, killed, or captured. The turret gunners' names rarely appeared in headlines. They were specialists, not aces. They did not fly fighters. They simply endured. By 1944, the air war began to shift. Long-range escort fighters appeared in greater numbers. P-51 Mustangs roamed ahead of the bomber streams, hunting German aircraft before they could attack. The pressure on suicide Charley eased slightly. But the turret remained. And the men inside it kept climbing in because habit had replaced fear and duty had replaced choice. As missions grew more frequent, exhaustion hollowed out the crews. Laughing came harder, silence came easier. The turret gunner still descended first during combat, and still climbed out last. When the war finally began to turn, it was not because one position was safer than before. It was because enough men had stayed inside long enough to break the enemy's will. And many of them never lived to see the ground again. By the final year of the war, the sky over Europe looked different. Not quieter, just emptier. Where once German fighters rose in swarms to meet the bombers, now fewer appeared. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots were gone, replaced by boys with barely enough hours to fly, let alone fight. The bomber streams still flew the same routes. The flak still climbed. The danger was still real. But something fundamental had shifted. The ball turret was no longer a surprise. It was no longer a gamble. It was a certainty. Luftwaffe pilots who survived long enough learned to stay away from the belly. Those who ignored that lesson rarely lived to pass it on. The rotating sphere beneath the bomber had become an unspoken boundary, a place where attacks went to die. Inside it, the gunner watched fewer fighters approach. That did not bring relief, because every quiet mission carried the memory of louder ones. Veteran gunners no longer jumped at every vibration. They could tell the difference between flak concussion and structural damage. They knew when to fire and when to hold their fire. They had learned to read the sky the way sailors read the sea. But they had also learned what could go wrong. They had seen turrets fail without warning. They had felt the sickening drop when hydraulic pressure vanished. They had heard silence on the intercom when someone else stopped answering. Experience did not make the job safer. It only made the consequences clearer. As spring approached, missions multiplied. The Allies pushed deeper into Germany. Targets lay farther inland. Flight times stretched longer. Fatigue settled into the bones of the crews. Some gunners began to feel detached from their own bodies. Hours passed without memory. Minutes blurred together. The turret turned. The guns fired. The bomber shook. And afterward they could not recall exactly how it had happened. Medical officers called it combat stress. The men called it surviving. When Germany finally collapsed, the bombers stopped flying. There was no ceremony for the ball turret. No final mission where gunners climbed out and left it empty behind them. One day the hatch closed for the last time. Another day it never opened again. Survivors returned home to a world that could not imagine what they had endured. Families asked polite questions. Friends listened briefly, then changed the subject. There were no words for what it meant to spend a war curled inside a rotating steel sphere, staring straight down at death. Some men never spoke of it again. Others woke in the night, convinced they were falling. The ball turret disappeared from new aircraft designs. Technology moved on. War evolved. But the legend remained, passed down through memoirs, crew stories, and the quiet respect of those who understood. Suicide Charley was never a single man. It was every gunner who climbed into that sphere knowing the odds, knowing the risks, and choosing to go anyway. They did not charge forward. They descended, and in doing so, they helped carry the war across the sky and toward its end. Beneath the bomber, the turret once turned endlessly. Now it is still. But the courage that lived inside it has never stopped moving. Long after the engines shut down, the memories stayed airborne. For the men who survived Suicide Charley, peace did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in the quiet of ordinary mornings, in the sound of distant machinery, in the sudden tightening of the chest when something overhead passed too low, too fast. Some could never sit comfortably in tight spaces again. Some avoided basements, elevators, tunnels. Some flinched at the smell of oil or burned metal. They carried the turret with them. In reunions years later, former crewmen spoke easily about navigation errors, flak patterns, and weather over the Alps. But when the conversation drifted toward the underside of the aircraft, voices lowered, jokes faded, eyes moved away. Everyone remembered who had sat there. Photographs survived, black and white images of young men smiling beside aircraft that dwarfed them. The turrets gleamed beneath polished fuselages, clean and intact, untouched by fire or fear. The photographs lied. They could not show the cold. They could not show the noise. They could not show the moment when the hatch closed and the world narrowed to glass and guns. Histories would later count aircraft lost, factories destroyed, sorties flown. They would debate strategy and leadership and turning points. But none of those numbers captured what it meant to be alone beneath a bomber, suspended between earth and sky, fighting an enemy who believed you should not exist. Suicide Charley was never meant to be remembered. It was a solution, a necessity, a human answer to a tactical problem. And yet it became something more. It became proof that wars are not won only by generals or machines, but by individuals placed into impossible positions and staying there. Every time a bomber returned with holes in its belly instead of a missing wing, a ball turret gunner had done his job. Every time a formation held together instead of breaking apart, someone beneath it had kept watch. Every time a German pilot chose not to attack from below, fear had replaced confidence, and fear had been learned the hard way. Today, many of those turrets sit silent in museums, their glass polished, their guns inert. Visitors crouch beside them, surprised by how small they are. Some wonder how anyone ever fit inside. Few understand why anyone ever did. But the legend endures because it deserves to. Because once, high above a continent at war, courage did not stand tall or charge forward. It curled into steel. It locked the hatch, and it looked straight down. The most dangerous part of the mission often came before a single shot was fired. It began in the early hours, long before sunrise, when the crews were shaken awake in cold barracks and told to dress quickly. Outside, the airfields were dark, the bombers lined up like enormous sleeping animals, their shapes barely visible under floodlights. In briefing rooms, men sat shoulder to shoulder, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands, pretending not to listen too closely as the curtain was pulled back from the map. Red string traced a route deep into enemy territory. The longer the line, the quieter the room became. Ball turret gunners studied the map differently than the rest. They knew that factories, cities, and rail yards mattered, but what mattered more to them was the distance. Distance meant time. Time meant cold, fatigue, and exposure. Every extra mile was another opportunity for something to fail beneath the bomber. When the briefing ended, no one spoke much. Crews walked toward their aircraft in silence, boots crunching on frost-covered concrete. Engines started one by one, coughing smoke before settling into a steady roar. The ball turret gunner climbed aboard early, checking his equipment while the aircraft was still on the ground. Ammunition belts were inspected by hand, link by link. Oxygen lines were tested twice. Emergency cranks were touched, not because they would certainly work, but because touching them felt like preparation. Once airborne, the bomber climbed slowly, heavily, circling the airfield again and again as the formation assembled. At altitude, the gunner received the order he had been expecting. Ball turret, get in position. He crawled downward through the narrow passage, clipped his oxygen mask into place, and lowered himself into the sphere while the aircraft vibrated around him. The hatch closed. The sound was final. Hours passed like this. The bomber droned onward, engines locked at constant power. The gunner watched cloud layers slide beneath him, the earth far below appearing peaceful, almost unreal. In these moments the mind wandered dangerously. Veteran gunners learned not to let it. They scanned constantly, sweeping the sky beneath the formation, moving the turret in slow, deliberate arcs. Boredom was as dangerous as fear. It dulled reaction time. It invited mistakes. Then the flak began. At first it was distant, black puffs scattered harmlessly below, but as the formation pressed deeper, the bursts climbed higher, closer. The bomber shook with each concussion. The turret rattled violently, metal ringing against metal. From below, the gunner could see the pattern clearly. Flak rose in a staircase, adjusted shot by shot. German gunners were walking it upward, correcting their aim with brutal efficiency. A burst detonated just beneath the turret. The shock slammed through the sphere, throwing the gunner hard against his restraints. For a brief moment, the guns spun uselessly as the turret rotated out of control. Training took over. Hands steadied the controls, the turret stabilized, the scan resumed. Then came the fighters. They appeared as dots at first, climbing from the horizon, sunlight flashing off wings. The gunner tracked them instinctively, already knowing where they would be seconds later. He waited, not because he was calm, but because he had learned patience the hard way. The first fighter broke formation and dove upward, guns flashing. Tracer rounds streaked past the turret, some close enough to leave streaks of light across the glass. The gunner fired. The guns thundered, recoil slamming through his shoulders. Tracers climbed, converging. The fighter veered sharply, smoke trailing from its engine as it rolled away. Another followed. And another. The sky beneath the bomber became a battlefield compressed into seconds. Attacks came in waves, some lasting minutes, others breaking apart almost immediately. The gunner rotated constantly, tracking, firing, correcting. Spent shell casings clattered and vanished. The smell of burned powder filled the turret. The glass grew smeared with oil, dirt, and ice. At some point, the gunner stopped feeling the cold. This was the most dangerous moment of all. When the guns fell silent, the bomber flew on, scarred but intact. Engines burned unevenly. Control surfaces vibrated strangely. Somewhere above, another crewman shouted that he was wounded. The gunner remained inside. He stayed there through the long flight home, muscles locked in a single position, body aching in ways he would not fully feel until later. He watched the flak fade behind them, the fighters disappear, the coastline slip back under the bomber's shadow. Only when the bomber began its descent did tension return in full force. Landing was always a gamble. The turret had to retract fully, the gear had to deploy, the runway had to be long enough, the aircraft had to hold together for a few more minutes. The gunner waited for the signal. When it came, he cranked the turret upward, listening for any change in sound that might signal failure. The sphere slid into its housing with inches to spare. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. When the bomber finally stopped, engines shutting down one by one, the gunner climbed out slowly, stiff and unsteady. The ground felt unreal beneath his boots, solid in a way the sky never was. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he sat down and could not stand again for several minutes. No one commented. They all understood. Another mission survived did not mean the next one would be. And so, after food, after sleep that came in fragments, the cycle began again. Briefing, climb, descent into the sphere. Suicide Charley did not end with a single battle or a single campaign. It repeated itself endlessly, mission after mission, man after man, until the war itself finally ran out of men willing to challenge the underside of a bomber. There were missions that followed the pattern, and then there were missions that broke it completely. The crews could sense the difference early, the air felt heavier, the formation took longer to assemble, radios crackled with static that refused to clear. Small things, meaningless on their own, stacked together until unease settled in. This was one of those days. The bomber crossed the coast under a grey, featureless sky. Clouds sat lower than expected, forcing the formation into a tighter, more vulnerable altitude band. Below them, flak batteries waited, already calibrated for exactly this height. The first bursts came without warning. They detonated so close beneath the bomber that fragments struck the turret almost immediately. Sharp metallic impacts echoed inside the sphere, each one a reminder of how thin the armor truly was. The gunner felt vibrations travel directly through his spine, rattling teeth, blurring vision. He steadied himself and kept scanning. Then the intercom came alive with overlapping voices. Fighters forming low. Multiple contacts, 6 o'clock. Looks like a mass climb. The gunner rotated downward and saw them more than usual. Not scattered attackers, but a coordinated group climbing together, their approach disciplined and deliberate. This was not harassment. This was an attempt to break the formation. The first fighter fired from long range, its tracers arcing upward like a warning. Others followed, filling the air beneath the bomber with intersecting lines of fire. The gunner returned fire immediately, tracking one aircraft, then another, then swinging back again as attacks overlapped. The turret moved constantly, motors whining under the strain. Then it slowed. At first, the gunner thought it was his imagination, a momentary lag, easily corrected. He adjusted the controls, compensating manually. The turret slowed again. A warning light flickered briefly, then went dark. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. The gunner reported it, voice calm despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Above him, the crew acknowledged the problem, already running through emergency procedures. There was no time to troubleshoot properly. Fighters were still coming. The turret froze. It stopped rotating mid-motion, angled downward and slightly aft, guns locked in a position that covered only a narrow slice of sky. The gunner tried the controls again, nothing. He switched to the manual crank. The resistance was immediate and brutal. Turning it required full-body effort, muscles screaming as the bomber shook violently around him. Inch by inch, he forced the turret to move, but it was slow, painfully slow, and the fighters knew it. A Messerschmitt flashed past the edge of the glass, firing as it climbed. Rounds struck the bomber's underside above the turret, tearing into the fuselage. Another followed seconds later, passing just outside the gunner's limited field of fire. He kept cranking. Sweat soaked through layers of clothing, instantly freezing against his skin. The crank slipped in his grip. He reset it and pulled again, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Above him, someone shouted that an engine was on fire. The bomber lurched. The intercom erupted with shouted instructions, overlapping commands, voices raised not in panic but urgency. The pilot fought to hold formation. The navigator called headings. The engineer reported damage faster than anyone could process it. Then the words came that every ball turret gunner dreaded. Prepare to bail out. For the gunner, the order felt unreal. He looked up instinctively, even though he could not see the rest of the crew. If the turret could not be raised fully, escape was impossible. The bomber was still at altitude, still under attack, still shaking from flak and gunfire. He cranked harder. The turret moved slightly upward, then stopped again. Another fighter attacked, this one closer than before. The gunner fired a short burst as it crossed his narrow firing arc. The fighter broke away, but the damage to the bomber was already done. Smoke streamed past the glass. The intercom crackled again. Ball turret status. The gunner reported honestly, partial movement, manual only, too slow. There was a pause, not long but heavy. Then the pilot's voice returned, measured and steady. Do what you can. It was not an order. It was acknowledgement. The gunner understood immediately. The crew would give him time, but not forever. If the bomber became uncontrollable, they would jump, and if they jumped before the turret was raised. There was no need to finish the thought. The gunner focused on the crank, ignoring the pain, ignoring the cold, ignoring the fact that the bomber was losing altitude. Each turn gained inches. Each inch felt like victory stolen from fate. Flak burst beneath the aircraft again, violently close. The shock nearly tore the crank from his hands. For a moment, darkness pressed in at the edges of his vision. He did not stop. At last, the turret reached the housing. Not fully, but enough. The gunner shouted into the intercom, voice hoarse, barely recognizable as his own. Above him, hands moved fast. The hatch opened. Arms reached down. They pulled him out as the bomber dropped lower, engines failing one by one. The aircraft barely held together long enough to reach friendly territory. When it landed, it did not roll to a stop. It skidded. Metal screamed against concrete. Sparks erupted beneath the fuselage. The bomber lurched violently, then settled into sudden, shocking stillness. For several seconds, no one moved. Then someone laughed. Another cursed. The gunner sat on the floor, back against the fuselage, unable to stand, heart pounding so hard it felt detached from his body. His hands shook uncontrollably. He did not try to stop them. That night in the barracks, he did not sleep. He lay awake, replaying the moment the turret froze, the pause after the bailout order, the sound of the crank slipping in his grip. He understood then that survival was not bravery or skill or even luck alone. It was timing. And timing eventually ran out for everyone. But the next morning, when his name appeared on the flight list again, he said nothing. He checked his gear. He inspected the turret. And when the order came, he climbed back inside. Because suicide Charley was not a place you escaped. It was a place you endured until the war decided otherwise. By the time the war reached its final year, fear no longer arrived suddenly. It arrived already unpacked. Ball turret gunners learned that terror did not always announce itself with flak or fighters. Sometimes it came quietly in the stillness before takeoff, when the engines idled and the crew waited for clearance. Sometimes it came in the long hours over friendly territory, when there was nothing to do but think. Veterans recognized the signs in themselves: hands that shook before climbing into the aircraft, short tempers, long silences, a reluctance to joke the way they once had. Innocence did not vanish in a single moment, it eroded mission by mission until it was gone. The turret no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a sentence. Late war missions were paradoxical. Enemy resistance had weakened, but the crews were more exhausted than ever. Bombers flew deeper and longer routes, striking targets that had survived years of bombardment. Flak remained lethal. Mechanical failures increased as aircraft aged past their intended limits. The Ball turret gunner watched all of it from below. He noticed how often the guns jammed now, worn by thousands of rounds fired in cold, thin air. He noticed how long it took the turret to respond to controls, how sluggish the motors sounded compared to the sharp whine they once made. Machines, like men, were tired. Some gunners began counting missions obsessively, not out of hope but calculation. They marked each sortie as a subtraction from a number that felt impossibly large. Others stopped counting entirely. Counting made the end feel farther away. Sleep became unreliable. When it came, it brought dreams of falling, of spinning endlessly with no horizon, of glass cracking inward while hands struggled to hold the guns steady. Many woke soaked in sweat, heart racing, convinced for a moment that the turret was still around them. Daylight erased nothing. During missions, fear became procedural. There was no panic left to spend. Movements were automatic. Scan, track, fire, clear, repeat. The mind retreated inward, leaving the body to function on training and repetition. This frightened some men more than the enemy, because it meant that when something went wrong, they felt nothing at all. One gunner remembered watching a fighter explode beneath his turret and feeling no reaction, no relief, no satisfaction, no shock, just acknowledgement, a task completed, another danger removed. Later on the ground, the weight of it arrived all at once, crushing and sudden, leaving him nauseated and shaking. Late in the war, the Luftwaffe grew desperate. New tactics appeared, reckless and violent. Some pilots attacked head-on from below, firing until collision was unavoidable. Others rammed bombers outright, sacrificing themselves in attempts to shatter formations. From the turret, these attacks were terrifyingly fast. There was no graceful approach, no time to track and lead. Just sudden motion, metal rushing toward metal, the sense that the sky itself was collapsing inward. Gunners fired reflexively, often unsure whether their rounds mattered or whether impact was inevitable. Sometimes it was. When collisions occurred nearby, the shockwaves were immense. Bombers lurched violently, turrets spun wildly as pilots fought to regain control. Debris slammed into the fuselage, leaving holes large enough to see daylight through. The gunner endured it all, suspended beneath the chaos, absorbing the violence through steel and bone. By this stage, replacements were rare. Surviving crews flew together repeatedly, bound by shared experience that needed no explanation. They trusted each other completely because they had to. The bull turret gunner became a known quantity, the man beneath them, the unseen guardian of the formation's most vulnerable angle. His voice on the intercom carried weight. When he warned of fighters below, crews reacted instantly. Respect replaced novelty. But respect did not erase risk. One final mission, weeks before the war's end, illustrated that truth with brutal clarity. The bomber had nearly reached the target when flak struck the underside, tearing through the turret housing. The gunner felt a sharp blow, followed by sudden pressure loss. Cold air screamed into the sphere as glass fractured. He reported the damage calmly, even as blood spread inside his glove from a cut he could not feel. The turret still moved, barely. He stayed at his post, firing through broken panels, the wind ripping at his mask, threatening to tear it free. The bomber survived. The gunner did too. But afterward he was grounded. Doctors cited injury, exposure, stress. He protested, he argued, he demanded to return to his crew. Command refused. When the war ended days later, he felt something close to guilt, not relief. Because he had not been there for the final missions. Because someone else had taken his place beneath the bomber. When victory was declared, celebrations erupted across airfields. Men cheered, hugged, cried openly. The long tension that had held them upright finally released. Bull turret gunners reacted differently. Some joined in, laughing harder than anyone else. Some sat alone, unsure what to do now that survival was no longer a daily calculation. Some stared at the turret one last time, hands resting on cold metal, feeling as if they were abandoning something that had tried very hard to kill them. Demobilization came quickly. Uniforms were returned. Aircraft were scrapped. The massive air war dissolved into paperwork and train tickets. The turret did not come home with them. Civilian life felt unreal. Rooms were too quiet. Ceilings felt too close. Silence pressed in where engines once roared. Many men carried habits with them, scanning rooms unconsciously, choosing seats with clear exits, flinching at sudden noise. Few talked about it. How could they explain what it meant to fight a war upside down, locked into steel, watching the earth rush beneath them while death came screaming upward? Years passed. The world moved on. But the legend remained, not in grand speeches or monuments, but in memory, in the unspoken understanding shared by those who had been there. Suicide Charley was never a myth. It was a lived reality, endured by men who were asked to give everything without ever being seen. And they did. The war ended, but the sky never truly emptied for those who had flown beneath it. In the quiet mornings, long after the engines were silent, the memories returned unbidden. The hiss of air through the fuselage, the clatter of spent shells, the vibration of recoil, they lived in the body long after the mind had tried to forget. Some gunners never set foot in an aircraft again. They chose safe, ordinary lives, filling hours with work and family, hoping the world above would remain distant. Others returned to the air in small planes, unable to resist the pull, chasing the ghosts of the sky that had once defined them. Stories were told sparingly. Families asked, friends listened. The full weight of what had been endured could not be explained. There was no way to describe being suspended in steel, looking down at the earth while death circled just inches away. There was no way to convey the intimate terror of knowing a single machine failure could end everything. Yet the legacy remained, etched into memory, whispered among surviving crews, passed down in letters, and quietly preserved in museums. The ball turret, once a lethal necessity, became a symbol. It represented courage in its purest, most elemental form, not heroics in the traditional sense, not glory sought or accolades earned. It represented the endurance of ordinary men forced into extraordinary circumstances, men who stared into death daily and responded not with panic but with disciplined resolve. They were unseen, they were unheard, they were for a time almost forgotten, but for those who knew and for those who study, the story of Suicide Charley endures. The small sphere of steel beneath the B-17's fuselage, with its twin 50 caliber guns and narrow glass, was more than a defensive position. It was a crucible, it was a mirror. It reflected the limits of human courage, the capacity to endure pain, fear, and isolation and emerge, if only barely, intact. Historians would record sortie counts, aircraft lost, enemy planes destroyed. They would analyze strategy, technology, and tactics, but none of those numbers could capture the intimate, terrifying world of the ball turret gunner. None could measure the minutes stretched into eternity as the turret jammed mid-combat, or the seconds when the air was filled with fire and steel, and only a body pressed against controls could hold the bomber together. Every turret had a story, every gunner had a name, and each story was a testament to the human will to survive. In post-war years, reunions brought these men together. They met decades later, older, quieter, their hair grey or gone, hands scarred or stiff from frostbite and repetitive strain. They shared tales with those who had lived it, stories of flak bursts that tore through formations, fighters that attacked from impossible angles, missions that lasted longer than the body could endure. The newer generations listened in awe, realizing that the images in textbooks and documentaries were only shadows of the lived reality. For the men themselves, the war never truly ended. Nights were often haunted by the roar of engines, the streaks of tracers against cloud, the sudden lurch of a damaged bomber. Some dreamed of the turret, curled inside it, rising and falling with every burst of enemy fire, hands frozen on the triggers. Some woke in terror, convinced for an instant that the hatch had closed and they were still suspended miles above ground. But there was also pride, quiet, unspoken pride in survival, in having faced death again and again without surrendering to it. Pride in protecting crews below, in holding the formation together, in being the unseen shield between life and annihilation. The physical remnants of those turrets now sit in museums, polished and inert, far removed from the chaos they once contained. Visitors crouch beside them, marveling at the small space, the intricate controls, the impossibility of living inside such a confined sphere. Few imagine the courage it took to climb inside, to embrace the danger with nothing but training, instinct, and sheer willpower. The legend of Suicide Charley is not one of myth or exaggeration. It is not embellished by Hollywood or rumor. It is documented in the lives of men who survived against staggering odds, who endured unimaginable stress, cold, and isolation, and who still climbed back into the turret day after day. It is preserved in letters, reports, and oral histories, and it lives in the respect of those who understand what true courage requires, not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. In the end, the ball turret gunner represents the essence of a certain kind of wartime bravery, quiet, unglamorous, relentless. They did not lead charges, fly solo fighters, or earn medals on the spot. They endured, they persisted, and by doing so they shaped the course of the air war over Europe in ways few recognized at the time. As the years pass, the stories continue to be told, and they continue to resonate. Each account, each photograph, each survivor's recollection adds to a collective memory of sacrifice and perseverance, and while the war itself is over, the lessons remain. Suicide Charley reminds us that courage is not always celebrated, that heroism does not always come with recognition, and that ordinary individuals, when placed in impossible circumstances, can achieve the extraordinary simply by enduring, by performing their duty, and by surviving against all odds. So when the sky is quiet, when the roar of engines is gone, and when history seems distant, the legacy of the ball turret gunner persists. In every spinning sphere of steel suspended beneath a bomber, in every trigger squeezed in desperation, in every heartbeat that outlasted flak, fire, and machine, there is a story. It is a story of fear and endurance, of pain and survival, of humanity tested to its limit. It is the story of Suicide Charley.